What if everything you thought you knew about human history was only half the story? Picture yourself standing in a frozen forest 40,000 years ago. Your joints ached from the cold. Your stomach is empty. And somewhere behind you, at the edge of the tree line, something is watching. Not wolves, not bears, people, or at least something very close to it. They were here long before you. Long before your kind arrived with sharpened tools, campfire stories, and an unstoppable drive to spread across every continent on Earth. And today, they're gone. Every single one of them. But you're still here, Homo sapiens. The last human standing. It wasn't just one other human species that vanished. It was several. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, Homo naledi. An entire family of human beings, all gone. How does a world go from multiple human species to exactly one? The answer involves supervolcanoes, interspecies relationships, half Neanderthal children, and prehistoric drama nobody talks about enough. And it starts right now. If this already has you thinking, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment below telling me which extinct human species fascinates you the most, because what's coming will completely change the way you see what it means to be human. Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa. But here's the thing, we were not alone, not even close. At roughly the same time, Neanderthals were thriving across Europe and Western Asia, building lives, raising families, surviving ice ages that would have broken most creatures. The Denisovans were spreading across Eastern Asia, leaving almost no physical trace but an undeniable genetic footprint. And Homo erectus, one of the longest surviving human species in the entire history of this planet, was still holding on in parts of Asia. And then there were the ones that truly bend the imagination. Deep in the islands of Southeast Asia lived Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits. Tiny, small-brained, island-dwelling human beings who somehow managed to survive on the island of Flores for an almost absurdly long stretch of time. They weren't a myth, they were real people. But even that wasn't the full picture. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa in 2013, had a brain roughly the size of an orange. And yet, evidence suggests it was burying its dead in deep cave systems, a behavior we've long associated with far more cognitively advanced species. That discovery alone forced scientists to rethink everything they assumed about early human intelligence and behavior. At various points across the last 500,000 years, there may have been as many as 6 or 7 distinct human species alive simultaneously. 6 or 7 different kinds of people, all walking this earth at the same time, lighting fires, raising children, and fighting to survive. The world wasn't empty when we arrived, it was crowded, and what happened next inside that crowded, complicated, deeply human world is where the story gets truly unsettling. Here's the part that really gets under your skin. Neanderthals were not shuffling, grunting creatures driven purely by instinct. The archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. They buried their dead, they used pigments, most likely for body decoration. They crafted jewelry from eagle talons, and if you've ever seen an eagle talon up close, you know that's not a small thing. They controlled fire, hunted massive megafauna, and actively cared for their wounded. Think about what that last part really means. Caring for the injured requires empathy. It requires choosing someone else's survival over your own comfort and resources. There are Neanderthal remains showing individuals who survived serious physical disabilities for years, not days, years. That kind of survival doesn't happen alone. It happens because a community decided that person was worth keeping alive. One of the most striking examples comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraq. A Neanderthal individual was found with a withered arm, a damaged eye socket, and severe arthritis. He lived to what would have been considered old age for that era. He couldn't have hunted. He couldn't have fully provided for himself. And yet he survived because others around him made sure he did. That's not animal behavior. That's profoundly, unmistakably human behavior. These were thinking, feeling, socially connected human beings doing their absolute best in an incredibly harsh world. They had culture, they had community, they had compassion, and for hundreds of thousands of years, that was enough to survive everything this planet threw at them. But then something changed. Something arrived that none of their accumulated survival knowledge had ever prepared them for. And that arrival would set in motion one of the most consequential series of events in the entire history of life on Earth. When our ancestors began their great expansion out of Africa around 70,000 years ago, They didn't walk into an empty world. They moved through territories that other human beings had called home for hundreds of thousands of years. These weren't uninhabited landscapes waiting to be discovered. They were lived and known, deeply familiar places to someone else. And everywhere modern humans went, the same pattern emerged. The locals started disappearing. Neanderthals vanished around 40,000 years ago, shortly after Homo sapiens arrived in Europe in significant numbers. Homo floresiensis disappeared around 50,000 years ago, precisely when modern humans reached that region. Homo erectus in Java, gone. The extinction timeline keeps lining up with our arrival timeline, with a consistency that is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. It wasn't about intelligence. It was about competitive pressure, relentless, invisible, and devastating. When a population gets pushed into marginal environments, into smaller and more isolated groups, extinction doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like a slow silence. One generation slightly smaller than the last, one territory slightly narrower, one winter that nobody recovers from, and just like that, an entire human lineage disappears from the earth forever. But here's what makes this story far more complicated and far more personal than simple replacement. Now, this doesn't mean our ancestors were systematically hunting other human species. The process was almost certainly far more ordinary than that, and in some ways, that makes it even more tragic. When modern humans entered a territory, they competed for the exact same resources: food, shelter, land. They brought better long-range weapons, more sophisticated social networks, possibly more complex language, and vastly wider trade connections. Against that combination, existing populations simply had no room left to breathe. But here is where the story completely flips on its head, because we didn't just compete with Neanderthals. We also had children with them, and modern genetic analysis has made that undeniably, uncomfortably clear. If you have European or Asian ancestry, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal. That's not a metaphor. That's literally inside you, right now, as you're watching this. Think about what that really means. There was a period in human prehistory when modern humans and Neanderthals weren't just sharing territory, they were building families together. Children were born who grew up moving between fully Neanderthal communities and fully modern human ones, biologically belonging to both and fully to neither. That is one of the most remarkable and overlooked facts in the entire story of human evolution. The extinction of the Neanderthals was not a clean replacement. It was a messy, incomplete fusion. The majority of their population disappeared, yes, but not entirely. Fragments of them survived. They survived inside the people who came after. Neanderthal genes that influenced your immune system, your metabolism, your susceptibility to certain diseases are still doing their job tens of thousands of years later. They didn't vanish. They merged. And then there are the Denisovans, who take this even further into the extraordinary. We identified an entire archaic human population almost exclusively through DNA. The physical remains amount to a few teeth and a single finger bone. That's it. And yet people living in Tibet today carry a Denisovan genetic variant that helps their bodies process oxygen at extreme altitudes. A biological gift from a people who disappeared over 40,000 years ago, still working, still protecting lives. That kind of discovery changes everything about how we define survival. No extinction story is complete without a proper catastrophe, and this era had plenty of them. The period between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago was not a gentle time to be alive on this planet. The Earth was swinging through dramatic climate shifts, with glaciers advancing across the northern hemisphere, sea levels dropping over 100 meters in certain regions, and landscapes that supported thriving populations in one generation becoming frozen tundra in the next. The world was deeply, persistently unstable. For a highly adaptable species like Homo sapiens, that instability was brutal, but survivable. For species with smaller populations, more localized territories, and less cognitive flexibility, those same oscillations were potentially catastrophic. The margin between survival and extinction for those populations was razor thin, and the climate kept pushing them closer to the edge. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in what is now Indonesia erupted on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. It may have triggered a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Sunlight dropped, temperatures collapsed, food chains unraveled. Genetic evidence suggests that Homo sapiens itself passed through a severe population bottleneck during this period, total human numbers potentially falling to just a few thousand individuals. Every single person alive today descends from that impossibly small group of survivors. And then there is Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of Flores, and this species genuinely challenges everything. They stood roughly 1 meter tall, with brains the size of a chimpanzee's, and yet they manufactured stone tools and hunted pygmy elephants. A being with a chimp-sized brain, crafting weapons, coordinating hunts. Surviving on a remote island for an extraordinary length of time. Everything we think we understand about the relationship between brain size and intelligence, this tiny human quietly dismantles, and that's only the beginning of what the fossil record still has left to tell us. So what was the decisive advantage? Why did Homo sapiens survive when every other human species didn't? The most compelling answer points to something called behavioral modernity, and when you look at the archaeological record from around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, something genuinely shifts. Cave paintings, sculptures, musical instruments, long-distance trade networks, highly specialized tools, clothing engineered for specific climates. This wasn't just survival. This was a species actively reshaping its relationship with the world around it. The strongest hypothesis centers on a leap in language complexity. At some point, human language became recursive, meaning you could build ideas inside of ideas, plan for futures that hadn't happened yet, talk about things that weren't physically in front of you, and that changes everything. Suddenly, you can coordinate with large groups of strangers, you can transmit survival knowledge across generations with precision. You can create shared mythologies that bind people together into cooperative units capable of achieving things no small, isolated group ever could. The disappearance of other human species wasn't caused by any single thing. It was everything converging at once. Climate instability, competition with a cognitively supercharged species, the slow suffocation of small, isolated populations, interbreeding that absorbed fragments of the vanishing disease, and sheer bad timing. No single villain, no single moment. Just an accumulation of pressures that kept compounding until there was nothing left. And here is the thought that should genuinely unsettle you. We were not inevitable. We were a draft. One experiment among several running simultaneously. The experiment that succeeded wasn't necessarily the most deserving. It was the one that had the right tools, the right networks, and the right timing in a world that happened to reward exactly those advantages. Neanderthals had fire, community, and tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. And then, quietly, they were gone. If this video made you think differently about what it truly means to be human, about where we actually come from, what we carry in our DNA, and how close we came to never existing at all, then you already know this channel is exactly where you need to be. If you felt something watching this, you belong here. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the word ancient in the comments right now if this story hit differently for you. It helps more people find this content, and it tells me you're the kind of person who takes this journey seriously. Every comment genuinely matters. And if you're hungry for more, the next video is already on your screen. More hidden history, more forgotten humans, more truth about who we really are and how we got here. Don't let the story stop now.